Richard Harrington checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. Sunday brunches weren't part of his regular schedule, but his assistant Gina had called in sick, leaving him with no choice but to spend time with his son. At 52, Richard had built a real estate empire that spanned 3 states, with properties valued well into 9 figures. He'd earned his success through relentless work and an unwavering focus that left little room for anything else, including family. "Are you ready to order, Matthew?" Richard asked, barely looking up from his phone as another email notification demanded his attention. His 14-year-old son sat across from him, thin fingers adjusting the strap of his supportive brace. "I'm still looking," Matthew said quietly, his words slightly slurred from the cerebral palsy that affected his muscle control. Richard nodded absently, using the moment to finish typing his response to his project manager about a development in Phoenix. He'd never felt comfortable during these rare outings with Matthew. The divorce 3 years ago had been Richard's idea. He and Diane had grown apart years earlier, but the custody arrangement had been hers. She took the beach house in California and most of their joint assets. He kept primary custody of Matthew, along with a staff of caregivers to manage what Richard couldn't or wouldn't handle himself. The restaurant hummed with Sunday morning activity. Richard had chosen Bellamy's because it was upscale enough to guarantee good service, but not so exclusive that Matthew's occasional outbursts or dropped utensils would cause a scene. He'd learned that lesson the hard way at the Peninsula last year, when the stares from neighboring tables had made even Richard, usually immune to public opinion, squirm with discomfort. "Would you gentlemen like to start with some drinks?" Richard looked up, ready to give his standard order, but the words caught in his throat. The waitress standing beside their table wasn't looking at him at all. Instead, her warm brown eyes were fixed directly on Matthew, her smile genuine as she waited for his response. "Apple juice, please," Matthew said, his face brightening at being addressed first, something Richard suddenly realized rarely happened when they were out together. "Excellent choice," the waitress said. "And for you, sir?" She turned to Richard, her expression professional but kind. "Black coffee," Richard replied, studying her name tag. "Thank you, Tanya." As she walked away, Richard noticed Matthew watching her too. There was something different about this waitress, Tanya, that Richard couldn't quite place. She moved with an easy confidence through the restaurant, stopping to chat with an elderly couple, helping a mother settle a high chair for her baby, all while balancing trays and taking orders. "She's nice," Matthew commented, the slight tremor in his hands more pronounced as he unfolded his napkin. Richard nodded, surprised by the observation. Matthew rarely commented on strangers. Years of curious stares and awkward interactions had taught him to keep to himself in public. When Tanya returned with their drinks, she placed Matthew's apple juice in a sturdy tumbler rather than the tall, precarious glasses the restaurant typically used. The small consideration wasn't lost on Richard. Without making a show of it, she'd noticed Matthew's motor difficulties and adapted. "Have you decided what you'd like to eat?" she asked, again addressing Matthew directly. "Pancakes with strawberries," Matthew replied, "but not with the cream on top." He looked down, adding softly, "I sometimes have trouble with the spoon." "No problem at all," Tanya said, jotting down the order. "I'll have the kitchen slice the strawberries a bit smaller too, if that helps." Matthew's face lit up with surprise. "Yes, please." Richard felt a strange tightness in his chest. How many restaurants had they visited over the years? How many servers had he generously tipped? Yet he couldn't recall a single one who had shown such thoughtful attention to his son's needs without making him feel different or burdensome. "I'll have the steak and eggs," Richard said when Tanya turned to him. "Medium rare." As Tanya collected their menus, the restaurant's sound system switched from ambient background music to a jazzy piano piece. Matthew's eyes widened with recognition. "I know this one," he said, more to himself than to Richard. His fingers began to tap against the tabletop, finding the rhythm despite their uneven movements. Tanya paused, listening. "Miles Davis, right? Blue and Green?" Matthew nodded eagerly. "You know jazz?" "My grandfather played saxophone in clubs all over Chicago back in the day," Tanya explained. "He made sure all us grandkids knew the classics." For the next minute, Richard became invisible as Matthew and Tanya exchanged favorite musicians and albums. Richard felt a flicker of shame. He'd paid for years of music therapy because Matthew's doctors had recommended it for coordination. but he couldn't have named a single artist his son enjoyed. I like dancing to it, Matthew admitted, a blush creeping up his neck. Just in my room, though. Dancing's the best, Tanya agreed. Nothing makes you feel more alive than moving to music you love. Matthew's expression clouded. I'm not very good at it. My legs don't always work right. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, preparing for the awkward sympathy that usually followed such admissions. He reached for his phone, a habitual escape from emotional moments, but Tanya surprised him again.
You know what my dance teacher always said?
It's not about how your body moves. It's about how the music moves through your body. Matthew considered this, his brow furrowed in thought. Besides, Tanya continued, some of the best dancers I know don't have perfect bodies. They just have perfect passion for the music. When she left to place their orders, Richard noticed a change in Matthew's posture. He sat straighter, his eyes following Tanya as she moved through the restaurant. For the first time in months, Richard put his phone away completely. Suddenly curious about the son he realized he barely knew. Do you dance often? In your room? Richard asked. Matthew looked surprised at the question. Sometimes, Ms. Patricia, my physical therapist, says it's good exercise. He hesitated. I have videos, tutorials I follow. Richard nodded, struggling for follow-up questions. Work conversations came easily. Direct, purpose-driven exchanges about concrete objectives. But asking his son about his interests felt like navigating foreign territory without a map. Their food arrived, and Richard noticed how Tanya had arranged Matthew's plate. Everything positioned for easier access. The pancakes pre-cut into manageable pieces without making it look like a child's meal. Again, consideration without calling attention to it. As they ate, Richard attempted small talk about Matthew's classes, receiving polite but brief responses. The distance between them felt vast, though they sat just 3 feet apart. Richard wondered when exactly this gulf had formed, or if it had always been there, and he was only now becoming aware of it. The restaurant had grown busier, but Tanya still checked on them regularly, refilling drinks and asking Matthew questions about books and movies that drew him out of his shell more effectively than Richard ever could. When the piano music returned, a livelier tune this time, Matthew's entire demeanor changed. His eyes closed briefly, head tilting slightly as he absorbed the melody. Tanya approached with coffee pot in hand. Great song, right? Makes you want to move. Matthew nodded, though his smile dimmed. Wish I could. Richard prepared to intervene to change the subject to something less sensitive, but Tanya set down her coffee pot. Why can't you? She asked, not with pity but with genuine curiosity. Matthew gestured vaguely at his legs, the braces visible beneath his pant legs. I'd look silly. Can I tell you a secret? Tanya leaned closer. Everybody looks a little silly when they dance. That's part of the joy of it. The restaurant had cleared somewhat after the brunch rush, leaving a small open area near their table. Tanya extended her hand toward Matthew. Show me one move, she said. Just one. Your favorite. Richard felt panic rise in his throat. I don't think... But Matthew was already pushing back his chair, a mix of terror and excitement on his face. He gripped the edge of the table for support as he stood. You don't have to, Richard said quickly, imagining the stairs, the possibility of Matthew falling. I want to, Matthew replied, with a determination Richard had rarely heard from him. Tanya didn't pull Matthew toward the open space. Instead, she waited, allowing him to set the pace as he carefully stepped away from the table. When they reached the small clearing, she stood facing him about a foot away. What's your go-to move? She asked. Matthew hesitated, then shifted his weight slightly, moving one shoulder forward then back while his hand made a small circular motion. The movement was subtle, limited by his body's constraints, but deliberate. Like this? Tanya asked, mirroring his movement. Matthew nodded, a smile breaking across his face. But you can do it bigger. I don't know, Tanya said thoughtfully. I kind of like your version better. It's more... She searched for the word. Controlled. Refined. She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Matthew took it. Slowly, they began to move together, Tanya following Matthew's lead. His movements were restricted, sometimes jerky, but she responded to each one as if they were dancing at a competition. Richard sat frozen, his coffee forgotten. His first instinct had been embarrassment, a reaction he immediately felt ashamed of. But as he watched his son's face, he saw something he couldn't remember ever seeing before. Pure, uninhibited joy. The dance lasted less than a minute. No one in the restaurant even seemed to notice. But in that brief moment, Richard saw his son not as a responsibility or a challenge, but as a person with desires, talents, and courage that far exceeded his own. When they returned to the table, Matthew was breathing hard, his face flushed with excitement rather than exertion. "That was awesome," he said, the words tumbling out faster than usual. "Did you see, Dad?" "I saw," Richard replied, his voice unexpectedly hoarse. "You've got rhythm, Matthew." For the rest of the meal, Matthew talked more than Richard could ever remember, mostly about music and dance videos he followed online. Richard listened, really listened, glimpsing a person he'd been living with but never truly seeing. As they prepared to leave, Richard left his usual generous tip, but it felt inadequate for what Tanya had given them. It wasn't the dance itself. It was the dignity she'd offered Matthew, the chance to lead rather than be led, to be seen rather than watched. Walking to the car, Matthew's gait was uneven as always, but there was a new confidence in his posture. Richard found himself slowing his own pace, not out of impatience but with a desire to extend their time together. "Maybe we could come back next Sunday," Richard suggested as he helped Matthew with his seatbelt. Matthew looked up, surprised and suspicious, as if waiting for the catch. "Don't you have work?" "Work can wait," Richard said, the words feeling foreign yet right on his tongue. "Some things are more important." As he started the car, Richard glanced at his son in the rearview mirror. For the first time, he wondered what other invisible parts of Matthew he had failed to see, and what it might take to discover them before it was too late. The memory of that Sunday morning haunted Richard for days afterward. He found himself thinking about it during meetings, while reviewing contracts, and in the quiet moments before sleep. The image of Matthew dancing, his face transformed by joy, kept appearing in Richard's mind when he least expected it. "Mr. Harrington, the investors are waiting," his executive assistant, Gina, reminded him as he stared out his corner office window at the Chicago skyline. "Right. Of course." Richard gathered his presentation materials and straightened his tie. He was distracted, something unprecedented in his carefully controlled life. 3 days after their brunch, Richard found himself driving past Bellamy's on his way home. Without consciously deciding to do so, he pulled into the parking lot. He told himself he just wanted a good cup of coffee. The hostess recognized him immediately. Richard Harrington was the kind of customer staff remembered, both for his wealth and his demanding nature. "Just one today, Mr. Harrington?" she asked, glancing behind him. "Yes," he replied, suddenly feeling foolish. What was he doing here? He requested a table in the back corner, a spot that offered a view of most of the restaurant. For the next hour, Richard nursed a single cup of coffee, watching Tanya work. She hadn't noticed him yet, busy with the dinner crowd that was building. Richard observed how she interacted with each table differently. With an elderly man dining alone, she lingered, asking about his day. With a frazzled mother trying to manage twin toddlers, she brought extra napkins and crayons without being asked. With businessmen similar to Richard, she was efficient but warm, somehow making each person feel specifically attended to. It wasn't just Matthew, Richard realized. Tanya treated everyone as if they mattered. When she finally spotted him, her eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. She finished taking an order before making her way to his table. "Mr. Harrington," she greeted him. "No Matthew today?" "He has physical therapy on Wednesdays," Richard heard himself saying, surprised that he knew this detail of his son's schedule. Usually Gina kept track of such things. "I was in the neighborhood." Tanya nodded, maintaining her professional smile. "Just coffee again?" "Yes, thank you." As she turned to leave, Richard blurted out, "He hasn't stopped talking about you." Tanya paused, her expression softening. "Matthew's a great kid. He's been showing me dance videos on his tablet," Richard continued, feeling strangely nervous. "Apparently he's been working with his physical therapist on choreography for months. I never knew. Kids have whole worlds inside them that we don't always get to see," Tanya said. Then, glancing at the growing line at the entrance, she added, "I should get back to work." Richard watched her go, struck by her words. Whole worlds inside them. The idea that Matthew had depths he'd never explored made Richard profoundly uncomfortable. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard developed a pattern. He would stop by Bellamy's a few times a week, always alone, always sitting at the same corner table. Sometimes Tanya was working, sometimes not. When she was, they exchanged brief, polite conversation. Richard learned that she was 29, was taking night classes in education, and had practically raised her younger sister after their parents died. Penny just started her second year of nursing school, Tanya mentioned one slow afternoon, pride evident in her voice. She's going to be amazing at it. That's quite an achievement, Richard replied. For both of you, Tanya shrugged. Family takes care of family. That's what my grandmother always says. The simple statement hit Richard like a physical blow. Family takes care of family. Had he ever truly taken care of Matthew? He'd provided financially, certainly. The best schools, the best doctors, the best therapists. But care went beyond provision, didn't it? At home, Richard began noticing things he'd overlooked for years. Matthew's room, which he rarely entered, was filled with evidence of a rich inner life. Bookshelves lined with poetry and history, sketches taped to the walls, surprisingly good ones created with adaptive drawing tools, a calendar where Matthew had noted everyone's birthdays, including Richard's distant relatives whom even Richard often forgot. One evening, Richard stood in the doorway watching Matthew complete his homework. His son's movements were labored but determined as he typed on his specially designed keyboard. Need any help? Richard asked, immediately feeling foolish. He hadn't helped with homework since Matthew was in elementary school. Matthew looked up, clearly surprised by the offer. I'm good, thanks. Just finishing an essay on the Civil War. Richard nodded, lingering awkwardly. You know, I majored in history in college. Before business school, really? Matthew's genuine surprise made Richard realize how little of himself he'd shared with his son. I didn't know that. There's a lot we don't know about each other, Richard admitted, the words difficult to say but necessary. Maybe we could change that. The tentative smile that spread across Matthew's face was worth the discomfort of vulnerability. That night, unable to sleep, Richard wandered the halls of their large, quiet house. He paused outside Matthew's room, hearing faint sounds from within. Concerned, he gently pushed the door open. Matthew wasn't in bed. He stood in the center of his room, leaning on his supportive cane, moving slowly to music playing softly from his tablet. His physical therapist, Patricia, stood nearby, occasionally offering guidance but mostly letting Matthew find his own rhythm. Richard quickly stepped back, not wanting to interrupt or embarrass Matthew. But he remained just outside the door, watching through the narrow opening as his son worked through movements that clearly caused him pain, but also brought him evident satisfaction. That's it, Patricia encouraged as Matthew completed a turn. Remember, dance isn't about perfection. It's about expression. The words echoed Tanya's sentiment at the restaurant. Richard stayed until the session ended, watching his son's determination with a mixture of awe and shame. How had he never seen this side of Matthew? This persistence, this courage, this willingness to work through difficulty for something that brought him joy? The next day, Richard did something unprecedented. He canceled his meetings and went to Matthew's school. The principal was surprised to see him instead of Gina or one of the other staff who usually handled Matthew's affairs. I'd like to observe some of Matthew's classes today, Richard explained. If that's possible. The principal readily agreed, and Richard spent the day as a silent observer in the back of classrooms. What he saw humbled him. Matthew was well liked by his teachers and respected by his peers, not out of pity but because of his insightful contributions and kind nature. In English class, the teacher read one of Matthew's poems aloud as an example of excellent work. In history, Matthew helped another student understand a complex concept about the Industrial Revolution. This was a Matthew that Richard had never known existed, a thoughtful, intelligent young man with friends and accomplishments of his own that evening. When Matthew arrived home from his after-school activities, he found Richard waiting in the kitchen rather than his usual caregiver. Dad. Is everything okay? Matthew asked, clearly concerned by this deviation from routine. Everything's fine, Richard assured him. I thought maybe we could have dinner together. I picked up food from that Italian place you like. Matthew's suspicion was evident. Don't you have work? Work will always be there, Richard said, echoing the sentiment he'd expressed after their brunch. I want to hear about your day. As they ate, Richard asked about the poem his teacher had read, about Matthew's friends, about his upcoming history test. Simple questions that any father might ask, but which felt foreign on Richard's tongue. Matthew answered cautiously at first, then with growing enthusiasm as he realized Richard's interest was genuine. When Matthew mentioned a school dance coming up, Richard felt a tightening in his chest. "Are you going?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Matthew shook his head. "Those aren't really for me." "Because of the dancing?" Richard ventured. "Partly," Matthew admitted. "But also, I don't know. It's hard to explain." Richard thought about Tanya, about her way of seeing people for who they truly were. "I think I understand. But after what I saw at the restaurant, you're a better dancer than you give yourself credit for." Matthew looked up, surprised. "You really think so?" "I do," Richard said, meaning it. "And I think maybe I could help you practice, if you wanted." The suggestion hung between them, fragile and unprecedented. Richard held his breath, half expecting Matthew to laugh or dismiss the offer. Instead, Matthew's eyes filled with tears. "You'd do that?" "I'd like to try," Richard said, his own voice unsteady. "I'd like to try a lot of things I should have done a long time ago." Later that night, after Matthew had gone to bed, Richard found himself staring at his own reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at him was successful, powerful, wealthy, and deeply lonely. He had built an empire while neglecting the only relationship that truly mattered. He thought about Tanya again, about her kindness and her words. Family takes care of family. He thought about Matthew's hidden talents, his courage, his daily battles that Richard had largely ignored. For all his business acumen, Richard had failed at the most important job he'd ever had, being a father. The realization was painful but clarifying. He couldn't change the past 3 years or the 11 before that, but tomorrow was still unwritten. Richard made a decision then, standing alone in his marble bathroom. He would learn about his son, truly learn about him. He would see the world Matthew had created for himself, and perhaps, if he was very lucky, Matthew would allow him in. It wouldn't be easy. Trust once broken took time to rebuild. But watching Matthew dance had shown Richard something essential. His son had a strength and resilience that Richard himself could learn from. Family takes care of family. It was time Richard learned what that really meant. For the first time in years, Richard Harrington was nervous. He sat in his car outside Bellamy's, hands gripping the steering wheel, rehearsing what he wanted to say. It had been nearly a month since that first Sunday brunch with Matthew. In that time, Richard had made small but significant changes in his life. He'd started coming home for dinner 3 nights a week. He'd attended Matthew's school presentation on civil rights leaders. He'd even sat through several dance practice sessions, awkwardly clapping along to the beat while Matthew and his physical therapist worked on routines. But today, Richard was here alone, with a purpose that made his heart beat faster than any multi-million-dollar negotiation ever had. The evening dinner rush was just ending when Richard entered the restaurant. He asked the hostess if Tanya was working and felt an odd relief when she nodded. "Her shift ends in about 20 minutes, the hostess added. "Would you like a table?" Richard shook his head. "I'll wait at the bar, thank you." From his seat, he could see Tanya moving efficiently between tables, that same genuine warmth in her interactions that had first caught his attention. She noticed him after a few minutes, giving a quick wave of recognition before returning to her customers. When she finally approached him, she seemed tired but still carried that same positive energy. "Mr. Harrington, no Matthew again today?" "Actually, I came to speak with you," Richard said, feeling oddly formal. "I was wondering if you had a moment after your shift." Curiosity flashed across Tanya's face. "Sure, I'll be done soon." Richard nodded, trying to look more confident than he felt. He ordered a club soda and waited, checking his watch and his phone repeatedly out of habit. When Tanya finally joined him, she'd changed from her work uniform into jeans and a simple blue sweater. Without the context of the restaurant, Richard was struck by how young she seemed, closer to his son's generation than his own. "So," she said, sliding onto the bar stool next to him. "What can I do for you, Mr. Harrington?" "Please call me Richard," he said, then cleared his throat. "I have a business proposition for you." Tanya raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I've been watching you." Richard winced at his phrasing. "What I mean is, I've noticed how you interact with people, especially Matthew. You have a gift for connecting with others, for seeing what they need." He took a deep breath. "I'd like to hire you as a companion for Matthew." Tanya's expression shifted from curiosity to something more guarded. A companion? She repeated. Richard nodded eagerly, warming to his idea. Yes, someone to spend time with him, encourage his interests. His current caregiver is excellent with his physical needs, but she's older and they don't connect on a personal level. He named a salary that was triple what waitressing likely paid her. To his surprise, Tanya's expression hardened slightly. Mr. Harrington, Richard, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not looking for a new job. I can be flexible with hours, Richard pressed on, unused to rejection. You could continue your studies. And the pay, it's not about the money, Tanya interrupted gently but firmly. I don't want to be hired to be Matthew's friend. That's not how relationships work. Richard felt a flush of embarrassment. Of course, he'd approached this all wrong, like a business transaction. He was trying to purchase a solution rather than create one. I'm sorry, he said, genuinely contrite. I didn't mean to offend you. Tanya's expression softened. You weren't trying to. You're looking for help, and that's understandable. She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. Can I ask you something? Richard nodded, still feeling wrong-footed. Why me? Is it just because Matthew responded well to me that one time? Richard thought about it. Partly, he admitted, but also because you seem to truly see people, not their limitations or their status or what they can do for you. You just see them. He looked down at his drink. I'm not good at that. Tanya was quiet for a moment. No one's born good at it, she finally said. It's something you learn, something you practice. I wouldn't know where to begin, Richard confessed. Maybe I can offer an alternative, Tanya suggested. Have you heard of the Riverdale Community Center? Richard shook his head. It's about 15 minutes from here, Tanya explained. I volunteer there on weekends. They run an inclusive arts program for kids and young adults, many with physical challenges similar to Matthew's. An arts program? Richard repeated, intrigued. Dance, music, visual arts, theater, all adapted for different abilities. Tanya continued, her enthusiasm evident. The program's amazing, but they're always struggling for resources. She looked Richard directly in the eye. Instead of hiring me to be with Matthew, why don't you bring him to the center? Let him meet other kids who share his interests. And maybe you could consider helping the program itself. Richard sat back, considering her suggestion. It wasn't what he'd planned, but something about it felt right. Would you be there? He asked, if we came to visit. I'm there most Saturdays, Tanya confirmed. I could introduce you around. Richard nodded slowly. I'd like to see it first. Before I bring Matthew, Tanya smiled, the first genuine one since they'd begun talking. That's a good first step. They agreed to meet that Saturday morning. As they parted ways in the parking lot, Richard felt both disappointed and relieved. His solution had been rejected, but Tanya had offered something potentially more valuable, a path forward rather than a quick fix. That Saturday dawned clear and cold. Richard drove to an address in a part of Chicago he rarely visited. Not dangerous, but certainly not affluent. The Riverdale Community Center occupied a worn brick building that had likely once been a school. The parking lot was small, filled with a mix of older cars and several vans equipped with wheelchair lifts. Tanya met him at the entrance, dressed in sweatpants and a t-shirt that read "Art Has No Limits" across the front. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and without her waitress uniform, she looked even younger. Thanks for coming, she said, holding the door open. Fair warning, it gets pretty lively in here on Saturdays. As soon as they stepped inside, Richard was struck by the noise, not chaotic but energetic. Music played from somewhere, punctuated by laughter and conversation. The hallways were wide, clearly designed to accommodate wheelchairs and other mobility devices. Tanya led him to a large room where about 15 young people of varying ages and abilities were engaged in what appeared to be a dance class. Some stood independently, some used canes or walkers, and a few remained in wheelchairs, but all were moving to the music in whatever way they could. This is our senior dance group, Tanya explained. Ages 13 to 20. Richard watched, transfixed. A boy with Down syndrome was helping a girl in a wheelchair spin in rhythm to the music. A teenager with leg braces similar to Matthew's moved with careful precision through a series of steps. The instructor, a man with a prosthetic leg himself, called out encouragement and suggestions. They're preparing for a performance next month, Tanya said. Nothing fancy, just for families and friends, but they take it pretty seriously. As Richard observed, he tried to imagine Matthew here, among these peers who wouldn't stare or pity him, who might in fact understand him in ways Richard never could. Tanya showed him other rooms, a messy art studio where a group was creating a colorful mural, a music room where several kids were learning adaptive instruments, a small theater space where others rehearsed a play. Most of our instructors either have disabilities themselves or have family members who do, Tanya explained. Makes a difference when kids can see people like themselves succeeding. Richard nodded, thinking of the years he'd spent avoiding looking directly at Matthew's challenges, as if ignoring them would somehow make them disappear. They ended in a small office where an older woman was surrounded by stacks of papers and an ancient-looking computer. "This is Loretta, our program director," Tanya introduced them. "Loretta, this is Richard Harrington." Recognition flashed in Loretta's eyes. Richard's name was well known in Chicago business circles, but she simply extended her hand. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Harrington. Tanya mentioned you might stop by." For the next half hour, Loretta explained the center's programs, their funding challenges, and their vision for growth. The building needed repairs, they lacked proper equipment, and they could serve twice as many families with additional resources. "We make do with what we have," Loretta concluded. "The important thing is creating a space where these kids feel they belong." Richard found himself deeply moved by the center's mission. He thought about Matthew, who had never had a place like this, a community that understood him, that valued his abilities rather than focusing on his limitations. "I'd like to bring my son here," Richard said finally. "If that would be all right," Loretta smiled. "We'd be delighted to meet him." As they left the center, Richard turned to Tanya. "Thank you for this. It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" she asked. Richard considered the question. "Something more clinical, I suppose, less joyful." Tanya nodded. "That's what most people think disability programs should be. Serious, therapeutic, focused on fixing what's wrong." She made air quotes around the last word. "But sometimes what people need most is just a place to be themselves. A place where their differences aren't the first thing everyone sees." Richard thought about his own approach to Matthew's cerebral palsy, the endless rounds of therapies and treatments, the focus on improvement rather than acceptance. Had he ever given his son a space to simply be himself? "I think Matthew would like it here," he said quietly. "I think so too," Tanya agreed. "And maybe what?" She hesitated, then continued. "Maybe it would be good for you too." The parent support group meets on Thursday evenings. Richard's instinctive reaction was to refuse. Support groups were for people who couldn't handle their problems privately. But looking back at the building, thinking of the parents he'd glimpsed dropping off their children, he felt a sudden curiosity. What would it be like to speak openly about the challenges and joys of raising Matthew? What might he learn from others walking a similar path? "I'll think about it," he said, surprising himself with his sincerity. As he drove home, Richard felt a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced in years. The center wasn't a quick fix or a service he could simply purchase. It was something more valuable. A community that might embrace both Matthew and himself, challenging them to grow in ways Richard was only beginning to understand. The following weekend, Richard sat in the parking lot of the Riverdale Community Center, with Matthew beside him. Neither had spoken much on the drive over. Richard had simply told his son they were trying something new, and Matthew had agreed with the cautious trust that was developing between them. "So what is this place exactly?" Matthew asked, eyeing the worn brick building. Richard took a deep breath. "It's an arts center. They have dance programs, among other things. I thought you might like to check it out." Matthew looked skeptical. "Because of what happened at the restaurant?" "Partly," Richard admitted, "but also because I'm trying to listen better. To what you want, what you enjoy." He paused. "We don't have to stay if you don't like it." Matthew considered this, then nodded. "Okay, let's see." They walked slowly to the entrance, Matthew setting the pace with his cane. Richard fought his usual urge to hurry things along, to rush through what he once would have seen as an inconvenience. Instead, he matched his son's rhythm, noticing how the morning sunlight caught in Matthew's hair, how determined his expression was as he navigated the uneven sidewalk. Tanya met them at the door, her smile warm and genuine. "You came. I'm so glad." She bent slightly to address Matthew directly. "I'm Tanya. We met at Bellamy's a while back." "I remember," Matthew said, a slight blush creeping into his cheeks. You danced with me. Best dance partner I've had in ages, Tanya replied without a hint of condescension. Want to meet some more dancers? Matthew glanced up at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. Go ahead. I'll be right behind you. As Tanya led them through the building, Richard watched his son's reactions carefully. Matthew's expression shifted from nervousness to curiosity as they passed artwork created by center members, heard music from practice rooms, and glimpsed activities in progress. The dance studio was their final stop. About a dozen young people were warming up, some standing independently, others using various mobility aids. The instructor, a man Richard recognized from his previous visit, was demonstrating a movement sequence. This is Matthew, Tanya announced to the group. He's visiting today. The instructor, who introduced himself as Anton, immediately made space for Matthew in the circle. Perfect timing. We're just getting started. Do you have any dance experience, Matthew? Matthew hesitated. Just in my room, mostly. With videos. Self-taught. Those are often the most creative dancers, Anton said approvingly. Why don't you watch for a bit and join in whenever you feel comfortable? Richard started to step back, assuming his role was to wait quietly on the sidelines as he did during Matthew's therapy sessions. But Tanya stopped him. Parents can participate too, she said quietly. If you want. Richard froze. I don't dance. Neither did most of the parents when they started coming here, she replied. It's not about being good. It's about being present. Being present. The simple phrase hit Richard with unexpected force. How much of Matthew's life had he been physically present for but mentally elsewhere? How many moments had he missed while checking emails or making calls? I'll watch today, he said finally. If that's okay, Tanya nodded, not pushing further. The parent lounge is through that door if you want coffee. For the next hour, Richard observed the class from a chair against the wall. What struck him most was the atmosphere, encouraging but not patronizing. When participants struggled with movements, adaptations were suggested rather than expectations lowered. There was laughter, occasional frustration, and a palpable sense of community. Matthew remained hesitant at first, watching intently from the edge of the group. But when they began working on a simple routine to a popular song, Richard saw his son's foot tapping to the beat. Anton noticed too. Want to try this section, Matthew? It's just 4 counts like this. He demonstrated a simple upper body movement that didn't require much footwork. To Richard's surprise, Matthew nodded and stepped forward. The group made space for him naturally, without fuss. He attempted the movement, his execution shakier than the others but recognizable. The group immediately erupted in encouraging comments. Nice flow, man. You got it first try. Matthew's face lit up with the same joy Richard had witnessed at the restaurant. But here, surrounded by peers who understood his challenges, there was something more. A sense of belonging that Richard had never been able to provide alone. By the end of the class, Matthew had learned a short sequence and performed it with the group. His movements were limited by his physical capabilities, but he had clearly found a way to express himself within those limitations. Richard felt a tightness in his throat as he watched his son bow with the others at the conclusion of the class. As they prepared to leave, Anton approached them. You've got natural rhythm, Matthew. We'd love to have you join us regularly if you're interested. Matthew looked up at Richard, a question in his eyes. Richard nodded. If you want to, absolutely. I do, Matthew said, with more certainty than Richard was used to hearing in his voice. In the car on the way home, Matthew was unusually talkative, describing the techniques he'd learned and the people he'd met. Richard listened, asking questions, noting how animated his son became when discussing something that truly excited him. There's a performance in a few weeks, Matthew mentioned cautiously. Anton said I could participate even though I'm new if I practice. Then we'll make sure you can practice, Richard said. I could help if you want to show me what you're learning. Matthew looked at him skeptically. You don't dance, Dad. Richard laughed, surprised by how good it felt to do so genuinely. True, but I can learn. We both can. That evening, Richard made a phone call he'd been considering since his first visit to the center. Loretta answered on the 3rd ring, sounding surprised to hear from him. Mr. Harrington, is everything all right? Everything's fine, he assured her. Matthew had a wonderful time today, but I'm calling about something else. He took a deep breath. I'd like to help with the renovations you mentioned. The building repairs, new equipment, whatever's needed most. There was a pause on the line. That's very generous. Perhaps we could meet next week to discuss the details? Of course, Richard agreed. Then, before he could reconsider, he added, "And could you tell me more about the parent support group Tanya mentioned?" Over the following weeks, a new routine emerged in the Harrington household. Matthew attended dance classes twice a week, with Richard driving him each time. At first, Richard used the hours to catch up on work emails, but gradually he began staying to watch the classes. Sometimes he even participated in the parent-inclusive activities, awkwardly at first, then with growing comfort as he realized no one was judging his performance. On Thursday evenings, while Matthew had dinner with his caregiver, Richard attended the parent support group. Initially, he sat quietly at the back, listening to stories that ranged from heartbreaking to hilarious. Parents shared challenges with schools, healthcare, and public misunderstanding. They celebrated victories that might seem small to outsiders, but represented mountains climbed for their children. The third week, Richard finally spoke. He talked about his emotional distance from Matthew, his tendency to throw money at problems rather than engage with them directly. He admitted his discomfort with disability and his fear of doing or saying the wrong thing. To his surprise, heads nodded around the circle. He wasn't alone in these feelings. "My daughter was diagnosed at 3, one father said after Richard finished. "I worked late every night for a year afterward. Told myself I was securing our financial future, but really, I was hiding from a reality I didn't know how to face." "How did you change?" Richard asked. The man smiled sadly. "She got sick, really sick, and suddenly nothing else mattered. I realized I'd been missing her life while she was right in front of me." He looked directly at Richard. "Don't wait for a crisis to wake you up." Those words stayed with Richard, echoing in his mind during board meetings and conference calls. He began restructuring his schedule, delegating more, saying no to non-essential travel. His executive team was surprised but adapted. Gina, his assistant, seemed quietly approving of the changes. At home, Richard and Matthew developed new rituals. They cooked dinner together twice a week, with Richard learning to be patient as Matthew used adaptive kitchen tools. They read the same books so they could discuss them. And every evening, they practiced dance steps in the living room, laughing at Richard's stiffness and celebrating Matthew's increasing confidence. Richard's renovation project at the center moved forward quickly. New flooring in the dance studio, repairs to the leaking roof, updated adaptive equipment for the art room. He approached it as he would any business venture, bringing in experts and ensuring quality work, but he also listened closely to what the center's members and staff actually wanted, something he might not have done months earlier. The business world noticed the changes in Richard Harrington. When asked about his reduced schedule by a board member, he simply said he was focusing on long-term priorities. When a rival development firm questioned his commitment to a joint venture, Richard invited the partners to attend the community center's upcoming performance, to see what real commitment looks like, as he put it. Some understood, some didn't. Richard found to his surprise that their opinions mattered less to him than they once had. The night before the performance, Richard found Matthew in the living room, practicing his routine with intense concentration. Richard watched silently from the doorway, struck by his son's determination. Every movement cost Matthew effort that Richard could only imagine, yet he persisted, repeating sequences until they flowed as smoothly as his body would allow. "Looking good," Richard said finally. Entering the room, Matthew startled slightly, then smiled. "I'm nervous about tomorrow." "That's normal," Richard assured him. "But you've practiced hard. You're ready." Matthew nodded, then asked hesitantly, "Did you ever get nervous before big presentations or meetings?" Richard considered the question seriously. "Every time. Still do." "Really?" Matthew seemed genuinely surprised. "You always seem so confident." "That's the secret," Richard confided, sitting down beside his son. "Everyone's nervous. The trick is using that energy rather than letting it stop you." They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment. "I'm glad you found that place," Matthew said finally. "The center?" "I'm glad Tanya showed it to me," Richard replied. "But you know what I'm most glad about?" Matthew raised a questioning eyebrow. "That you were brave enough to dance with her that day at the restaurant," Richard said softly. You showed me something important even if I didn't fully understand it at the time. What was that? Richard smiled, placing a hand gently on his son's shoulder. That sometimes the best way to lead is to be willing to follow. 2 years had passed since that chance encounter at Bellamy's restaurant. The morning of the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Harrington Inclusive Arts Center dawned clear and bright, with early summer sunshine warming the freshly painted exterior of what had once been the Riverdale Community Center. Richard stood before the mirror adjusting his tie, not the power tie he would have chosen for a business event, but a colorful one Matthew had given him, decorated with small dancers in various poses. The gift had been a joke, but Richard wore it proudly today. "Dad, we're going to be late." Matthew called from downstairs. "Coming," Richard replied, taking one last look at his reflection. The man staring back at him was physically similar to the Richard of 2 years ago. Same strong jawline, same steel gray hair, but the eyes were different. Softer perhaps, more present. Downstairs, Matthew waited by the door, leaning lightly on a new carbon fiber cane. At 16, he'd grown several inches, his face losing some of its childish roundness. But the biggest change wasn't physical. There was a confidence in his posture, a clarity in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "You're wearing the tie," Matthew noted with a grin. "It's a special occasion," Richard replied. "Ready?" Together they walked to the car, Richard matching his pace to Matthew's without conscious thought now, a habit formed over months of walking together. The drive to the center took them through familiar streets. They passed Bellamy's restaurant and both glanced at it with knowing smiles. So much had changed since that Sunday brunch. The parking lot of the new center was already filled with cars and news vans. What had begun as a simple renovation had evolved into something much larger. When it became clear the old building couldn't be modified to meet all their needs, Richard had purchased the adjacent property and commissioned an entirely new facility, designed from the ground up to be fully accessible and equipped for arts education. "Nervous?" Richard asked as they parked. Matthew considered the question seriously. "A little. But the good kind of nervous, you know." Richard nodded. He did know. He'd felt that same productive tension before the board presentation, where he'd announced his company's new initiative to hire people with disabilities across all departments. The old Richard would have delegated such a presentation. The new Richard had delivered it personally, with Matthew beside him as a consultant on the project. They were greeted at the entrance by Anton, who now headed the dance program, and Loretta, who had transitioned from running a struggling community center to directing a state-of-the-art inclusive arts facility. "The press is already here," Loretta informed them, looking slightly overwhelmed. "And the mayor just called. He's running 10 minutes late." "No problem," Richard assured her. "We have plenty to celebrate today, with or without politicians." Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Students of all ages and abilities explored the new spaces. Dance studios with specialized floors to reduce impact on sensitive joints. Art rooms with adjustable tables for wheelchair users. Music studios with adaptive instruments. Everything had been designed with input from the users themselves. A process Richard had insisted on despite the additional time it required. "Richard!" A familiar voice caught his attention. He turned to see Tanya approaching, dressed more formally than he was used to seeing her, in a simple blue dress rather than her usual jeans or waitress uniform. She had completed her degree in education over the past 2 years, with some financial assistance from the scholarship fund Richard had established, a fund he'd insisted be named after Tanya's grandmother rather than himself. "You've outdone yourself," Tanya said, gesturing around the gleaming lobby. "When you said renovations 2 years ago, I didn't exactly picture this," Richard smiled. "Neither did I, but some projects take on a life of their own." "Like some relationships," Tanya replied, glancing meaningfully at Matthew, who was across the room showing a younger boy how to use one of the adaptive drawing tools. "How's the new job going?" Richard asked. After much persuasion, Tanya had finally agreed to leave waitressing to become the center's program director, though she still picked up occasional shifts at Bellamy's to keep her feet on the ground, as she put it. "Challenging. Rewarding. Exactly what I hoped for," she answered. "And I'm learning something new every day." "That makes 2 of us," Richard said sincerely. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. The mayor spoke about inclusion and community values, Loretta outlined the center's expanded programs. Anton invited several students, including Matthew, to demonstrate a dance piece they'd choreographed for the occasion. Richard watched his son move with the group, each dancer adapting the choreography to their own abilities while maintaining the unity of the piece. Matthew's movements were still limited by his cerebral palsy, but he had learned to work within those limitations to express himself beautifully. When it was Richard's turn to speak, he kept his remarks short. He thanked the staff, the architects, and the community members who had provided input on the design. He acknowledged the donors who had joined the project after reading about it in the business press. But his voice softened when he came to the final acknowledgement. "Most of all, I want to thank my son, Matthew," he said, finding Matthew's eyes in the crowd. "2 years ago, I thought I was helping him by building this center. I've since learned that he was actually helping me by showing me what truly matters." After the ribbon cutting, as guests explored the new facility, Richard found himself standing with Tanya and Matthew near the refreshment table. "I remember the first time you came to the old center," Tanya said to Matthew. "You were so nervous." "I was terrified," Matthew admitted. "I'd never been around so many kids like me before. I didn't know how to act. And now you're teaching the new kids," Tanya observed. It was true. Matthew had developed a knack for welcoming newcomers to the program, particularly those who arrived with the same fears he'd once had. He seemed to instinctively understand how to put them at ease, how to introduce them to activities at their comfort level. "Speaking of teaching," Richard said, "have you told Tanya about your idea for the summer program?" Matthew nodded enthusiastically. "I've been working on a curriculum for a film class. Not just watching movies, but actually making them. We could use phones to record, and I found some really simple editing software that works with adaptive equipment." As Matthew outlined his idea, Richard watched Tanya's reactions. She asked insightful questions, suggested resources, and treated his son's proposal with the seriousness it deserved. No wonder Matthew had flourished under her influence. She had never seen his disability as the most interesting thing about him. The afternoon stretched on, with various performances and demonstrations throughout the center. Richard moved between groups, listening more than talking, observing the community that had formed around this place. He recognized parents from the support group, now confidently guiding newcomers through the experience. He saw children who had been hesitant participants 2 years ago now taking leadership roles. Late in the day, as the crowd began to thin, Richard found himself alone in the main dance studio. The space was quiet now, the polished floor reflecting the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. "Penny, for your thoughts," came a voice from the doorway. Richard turned to see Tanya leaning against the frame, her shoes in her hand. "Just thinking about that day at the restaurant," he replied. "How differently things might have turned out if you hadn't been our waitress," Tanya shrugged. "Someone else would have come along. Matthew was always going to find his way." "Maybe," Richard conceded, "but I'm not sure I would have found mine without that push." Music drifted in from one of the other studios, a gentle melody that carried down the hallway. Tanya cocked her head, listening. "That's from the senior recital program," she said. "Matthew helped choreograph part of it." Richard nodded, pride warming his chest. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from his office about a development deal in Seattle. 2 years ago, he would have stepped out immediately to handle it. Today, he silenced the phone without checking the details. "It could wait. Dad?" Matthew appeared in the doorway beside Tanya, slightly out of breath with excitement. "Some of the kids want to show you the mural they made for your office. It's a surprise, but Dion can't keep a secret." "Lead the way," Richard said, following his son into the hallway. As they walked, Matthew chatted with Tanya about an upcoming workshop. Richard trailed slightly behind, observing how confidently his son navigated both the physical space and the conversation. The cane in Matthew's hand was now just a tool, not a definition. The hesitation that had once characterized his interactions with others had given way to a quiet assurance. The mural, when they reached it, took Richard's breath away. Created by the center's youngest artists, it depicted a diverse group of dancing figures, their forms abstract but joyful. At the center were 2 figures that were unmistakably meant to be Matthew and Richard, their hands linked in a dance step. "Do you like it?" asked a small girl in a wheelchair, her fingers still stained with paint. Richard knelt to her level, taking in the details of the artwork. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received," he said honestly. Later, as they drove home in the fading light, Matthew was unusually quiet. Richard glanced over, wondering if the day's activities had tired him out. "Everything okay?" he asked. Matthew nodded slowly. "I was just thinking about how much has changed. Not just the center, but everything. Good changes?" "Mostly," Matthew said with a smile. "Though you're still a terrible dancer," Richard laughed. "Some things are beyond even the power of positive thinking." They drove in comfortable silence for a while longer before Matthew spoke again. "You know what I realized today? 2 years ago, I thought my CP was the most important thing about me. At least that's what everyone seemed to see first. Now it's just part of me, not the main part." Richard reached over to squeeze his son's shoulder gently. "That's how I see you too." As they pulled into their driveway, Richard remembered something. "Oh, I almost forgot. Bellamy's called earlier. They're hosting a jazz brunch this Sunday. Thought we might stop by." Matthew grinned. "Think Tanya will be working?" "Only one way to find out," Richard replied. Together they walked into the house. Their pace matched, their steps aligned. Not because one was leading and one was following, but because they had finally learned to move through the world together.